Susan and John met on a blind date, built a wonderful family, and raised 2 children. Did the man know that one day he would experience in real life what it truly means to meet someone blind? Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The heartbreaking events we're going to talk about today took place in a city called Coral Gables, located about 11 kilometers from Miami. Coral Gables is an affluent part of South Florida, a beautiful place with lush green avenues winding through residential neighborhoods, historic landmarks, and world-class restaurants. There are wide roads, tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, Mediterranean revival architecture, countless stunning plazas, and fountains throughout the city. It was in this unique place that the Sutton family lived. Susan Marrier met John Sutton back in 1974 on a blind date. It was love at first sight. Everything developed quickly, and within a year, Susan became Mrs. Sutton. They shared very similar upbringings. John's father worked for a manufacturing company. The family lived in a Pittsburgh suburb in Pennsylvania. They had a nice house with a large backyard and a swimming pool. As a child, John never lacked for anything and was determined to create the same kind of life for his future family. Susan was a very beautiful woman. In her senior year of high school, she was prom queen. She later graduated from college and worked as a nurse in a surgical intensive care unit. That profession required certain qualities. Not everyone can work in the high-pressure environment of an operating room, where you have to control your emotions, see death up close, and then help patients relearn how to live. Susan was hardworking and deeply dedicated to her work. John was also successful. He graduated from the University of Miami School of Law, became an attorney, and quickly climbed the career ladder, so both spouses' careers were on the right track. The next step after the wedding was having children. The couple had everything one could dream of: financial stability, good health, and a wonderful relationship. Susan planned to get pregnant immediately after the wedding. She expected it to happen quickly since they were both young and healthy. But after several unsuccessful attempts, the Suttons received devastating news. Susan was infertile. The news of infertility is a difficult situation to go through. It either brings a couple closer and strengthens their bond, or it drives husband and wife apart. When one partner dreams of having children and the other cannot for some reason, a choice has to be made. Despite the serious trials, John and Susan stayed together and were determined to try everything to make their dream of a child come true. They consulted a reproductive specialist, and the woman began regular treatment. The couple had high hopes, but after several years of failed attempts to conceive, Susan opened her mind and heart to adopting a baby. Even if the child wasn't biologically theirs and John's, they could still give him or her so much. By that time, Susan was working as a senior nurse in the surgical ICU, and John had reached unprecedented heights in the legal field. He had even received an award given by fellow attorneys for outstanding achievement in law, high professional skill in jurisprudence, and excellent communication abilities. In April 1979, the Suttons were given the opportunity to adopt a beautiful baby boy just days after his birth. The baby hadn't even entered the world yet, but a loving family was already waiting for him. Every adoptive parent dreams of adopting a newborn, believing they can raise the child as their own. The Suttons were no exception. Chris was born on April 13, 1979, and it became the happiest day of the couple's life. They cherished every minute spent with him. Both John and Susan wanted to give this boy everything. They adored Chris. Happy and carefree, he ran around their big house, laughing and playing. He had a sea of toys. On vacations, his parents took him with them. Chris was loved beyond measure, and he returned that love to his father and mother. As the only child, he received all possible attention and was excessively spoiled. Susan even quit her job to stay home with Chris. Everything was simply perfect. But 7 years later, the Suttons felt they wanted to expand their family and thought about adoption again. They wanted to give Chris a little sister and themselves a daughter. Having had such a wonderful experience, they believed they could give their love and support to another child. In the end, they adopted a beautiful little girl named Melissa. Finally, they felt they had a complete family of 4. Chris coped well with the role of big brother. He loved Melissa very much, and they were quite close. The parents didn't want to hide anything from their children, so eventually they told Chris and Melissa that they were adopted. It changed nothing in the Sutton family. Although the children were not biologically related, they grew up side by side. The older brother always stood up for his little sister when someone teased her at school or caused her trouble. Susan and John wanted to give their children the very best because they themselves had grown up in comfort and dreamed of doing the same for their kids. Some might call it indulging whims, but the parents saw it as an expression of love. When Chris grew older, his mother and father continued to pay for his apartment and car until he could stand on his own feet. That's how the Sutton family appeared from the outside. But very soon, everything would change. Something incredible, utterly shocking and unexpected would happen. The life of this ideal family would be turned upside down. Happiness would turn into devastation. By 2004, the Suttons were living in a beautiful waterfront home in Coral Gables. They were considered a highly influential couple in Miami and were known and respected in their community. John's law firm was thriving. By then, he had practiced law for 20 years and wanted to keep the business in the family. That's why Susan took on all the administrative duties of office manager, including bookkeeping. Melissa was 18 and had started college to study law so she could become an attorney too. 25-year-old Chris was engaged to a girl named Juliet Driscoll, who answered phones at the law firm. Chris helped however he could. He worked on cases, did research, performed various office tasks, made bank deposits, and tried to be useful in every way. Chris and Juliet met while the Suttons were on a family cruise. John owned 3 yachts, and they often took trips to the Caribbean or the Bahamas, where they scuba dived and fished. Juliet learned everything from Susan, who took the girl under her wing. Working side by side with John was his longtime colleague and friend, Teddy Montoto. He was one of the people the Suttons trusted most. Together, they were really successful, so John eventually offered Teddy a partnership in the firm. John handled litigation against various companies, representing other corporations. Their cases involved big money. The last case they won brought the firm 3 major victories. Each award was over $1 million. The partners planned to celebrate the successful conclusion of the cases and decided to combine the celebration with Susan's birthday on August 20th. She turned 57, and 2 days later they held a dinner party. Melissa had just started college, so she couldn't attend. At the table were Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, their son Chris with Juliet, and John's law partner Teddy Montoto. Melissa called to congratulate her mom once more, saying she missed her and hoped the party would be wonderful. It was a lovely dinner among close people. Everyone drank a little wine, ate a piece of birthday cake, and chatted about future plans. No one knew how this pleasant day would actually end. As the party wound down, the hosts turned on the TV and watched the Olympics with their guests for a while. It was getting late. Chris and Juliet planned to catch a movie, so around 9:30 p.m., they got ready to leave. 15 minutes later, family friend Teddy also said goodnight to the hosts and went home. John went to the bedroom to watch a bit more TV. Susan was finishing up some chores around the house so she could go to bed too. Because John snored very loudly, his wife slept in their son's former room across the hall from the master bedroom. She couldn't get proper rest in the same room with John. Before falling asleep, she was talking on the phone with a close friend. At some point, John thought he heard a door slam downstairs or something heavy fall to the ground. He didn't even have time to figure out what it was when suddenly the door to his bedroom burst open and someone dressed in black entered and pointed a gun at John. All Sutton could hear were repeated bangs again and again. He desperately rushed around the room trying to hide from the shots, but 4 bullets hit their target. The room was a mess. One bullet went through the headboard, another shattered a mirror. John fell to the floor, bleeding but still breathing. Then the intruder left the room and headed to where Susan was sleeping. The wounded man could do nothing. He lay helplessly, listening as shots rang out one after another. Then the gunman returned to John and finished him off with 2 shots to the head. John's world went dark, but amazingly, he was still alive. The homeowner passed out, but at some point regained consciousness. He didn't know how Susan was, whether she was injured or what exactly had happened, but he realized he somehow had to reach a phone and call for help. John managed to open his eyes but saw nothing. The man knew his house layout very well and somehow, in the dark, stumbling and on the verge of death, managed to reach a phone and dial 911. He did everything he could to protect his family, his wife, and himself. Only a surge of adrenaline allowed him to get up despite the severity of his wounds. John even managed to open the front door and let the police in. Sutton was in critical condition, so he was rushed to Miami's trauma center. When examined, injuries were found everywhere, on his arms, face, and body. Blood flowed from his head and down. Doctors hurried to save his life, though they weren't sure they could. Meanwhile, police tried to find clues in the Sutton home and determine how the intruder had entered. The sliding glass door to the patio leading to the pool was open. It's possible the perpetrator entered through it. Detectives didn't know if it had been scratched earlier or if it happened during the break-in. Other officers walked down the long hallway to the bedrooms, checking room by room to make sure everything was okay. It was a fairly large house, and first they had to ensure the perpetrator had left and wasn't hiding somewhere. On the floor, police saw shell casings, broken glass, and blood. They still hadn't found Susan. She wasn't in the bedroom. Detectives noticed items lying on the dresser: wallet, money, other jewelry. Everything was untouched. If there had been a home invasion, it clearly wasn't for robbery. When officers approached Susan's bed, they saw a pile of blankets with bullet holes in them. After pulling back the covers, a heartbreaking scene appeared. The dead woman was still clutching the corners of the blankets over her head, as if trying to hide or block the bullets, but unfortunately, it hadn't saved her life. She lay on her back, and next to her was a bloody phone. Susan's face was severely damaged. There was a huge wound in the lower part. One eye had almost fallen out of its socket. Her forearm was so damaged that bone was visible. Even more shots had hit her torso. Police, frankly, couldn't understand who could have done this in an upscale neighborhood where violent crime was almost non-existent. Why had this family been targeted? Everything looked as if someone had deliberately come to this house with the firm intention of taking the Suttons' lives. While Susan's body was being transported to the coroner's office for autopsy, John faced emergency surgery. Doctors counted 6 bullet wounds on his body. 2 shots hit the head. 1 bullet entered the right temple and exited through the lower jaw. He also lost the tip of his ring finger and had his right thumb shot through. Another bullet was lodged somewhere in his chest. Detectives examining the house initially theorized that John had planned to harm Susan and then turned the gun on himself to deflect suspicion. He was a lawyer and knew how to stage it best. At that point, they still didn't know the man's true condition. That theory was quickly dismissed when doctors gave their conclusion. Sutton's head wounds were so severe that it was clear no sane person would shoot themselves in the temple just to fake an attack. The Suttons' younger daughter, Melissa, had no idea tragedy had struck her parents. It was her first day of college. She was starting classes while her father clung to life and her mother lay in the morgue. A friend called Melissa to offer condolences. That's how the girl learned in the most horrific way what tragedy had unfolded in her home. She frantically started calling her brother, then family friend Teddy, but no one answered. Only after some time did Teddy Montoto call Melissa back and then come pick her up to drive her to Miami to the hospital where her father was. Later that morning, Chris arrived at the scene. He saw police cars in front of his parents' house and couldn't understand what had happened. The young man approached one of the officers and explained who he was. He was then told the devastating news that his mother was dead and his father was in critical condition in the hospital. The young man was so shocked he couldn't hold back his emotions. After all, just yesterday they had celebrated Mom's birthday, and today she was gone. Tears welled up in Chris's eyes, and he rushed to the hospital to be with his father. The news about John was also grim. Doctors said the surgery had lasted 14 hours, but they had been unable to save John's eyesight. The damage to his head was too great. Unfortunately, he would never see sunlight again, and most likely would never be able to practice law or live the life he once had. The children sat by their father's bedside, talking to him to let him know they were there, but they had no idea how to tell him the news about the mother with whom he had lived for 29 years. John was in a medically induced coma. In the following weeks, the man slowly began to regain consciousness. One day, he even managed to say a few words. The first thing he asked was how Susan was doing. Melissa couldn't tell him the truth because John's life depended directly on his psychological state. Stress could kill him. Through tears, the girl lied to her father, saying Mom wasn't doing as well as he was. It was incredibly hard to hide the truth and give John false hope, but from a medical standpoint, it was vital for his survival. Investigators visited John every day, waiting for him to speak and hoping to learn details of the attack. But because the victim was on heavy medication, that opportunity didn't come for a long time. Meanwhile, they interviewed family and friends, as well as employees of John's firm, trying to figure out who could be behind this horrific crime. A lawyer could have serious enemies. Juliet, Chris's fiancée, recalled that John had recently won a case for a client, causing the client's ex-wife to lose a significant amount of money. Bailiffs came to her office and seized everything. This happened just days before the attack. The enraged woman had threatened Sutton's life. She stormed into John's firm and said she would get a gun and shoot him herself. Several people witnessed this heated exchange. Another piece supporting this theory came from a neighbor who heard the sound of a motorboat that night. The waterway ran right behind the houses. That night, no one heard or saw a car in front of the homes. It also happened that the woman who threatened Sutton owned a boat docked not far from John's house. However, this lead was also dropped because the suspect had a solid alibi. On the night of the attack, the woman was out of state, and a surveillance camera on her boat confirmed the vessel never left the dock. Detectives had to move on and keep looking for clues. Over the next few weeks, John drifted in and out of consciousness. Family and friends stayed by his side constantly, waiting for their father to fully regain consciousness so they could finally take him home. What surprised police most was how few clues there were at the crime scene. There were no fingerprints on the sliding glass door the intruder used to enter. The casings found in the hallway were from a 9mm pistol, but the murder weapon itself was missing. Investigators were also interested in whom Susan might have been talking to before her death and whether her caller had heard anything. Detectives went back to the reports from the night of the crime, hoping to find something. They learned that police had seen Teddy Montoto near the house. Moreover, he arrived before emergency services. Could the perpetrator have returned to the scene? How did Teddy know something had happened at the Suttons' house? Could he have deliberately left the door open that evening so he could slip in unnoticed at night and finish off the owners? Montoto was brought in for questioning, and the man told his version of that night's events. It turned out he was the one Susan had been talking to before bed. That looked suspicious. What could a married woman be discussing with her husband's business partner at that hour? Teddy assured officers their relationship was more than just professional. The Suttons were like family to him, and he and Susan were very close. During the phone call, Montoto suddenly heard a loud bang that sounded like a gunshot. Then the line went dead. He tried calling back, but no one answered. Fearing something serious had happened to Susan, he got dressed and drove to their house to check if everything was okay. Police were not convinced by this story. Investigators asked Melissa Sutton about family relationships, and the girl confirmed that Teddy was like a godfather to them. She and Mom could discuss work issues from morning till night. That was normal. Still, something in Montoto's story didn't add up. The man admitted he carried a 9mm firearm. The gun was taken for testing since it matched the caliber of the crime weapon. Moreover, Teddy said he had been target shooting the day before, so gunshot residue could be on his hands and clothes. With this statement, he further turned detectives against himself. An experienced shooter could easily hit a moving target like John. Teddy also had motive, money, means, and opportunity to eliminate his partner and take sole control of the firm. The Sutton family friend was asked to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. His gun was sent for forensic examination to see if the casings matched those found at the scene. The lie detector showed Montoto was lying. He had not told the truth about his relationship with Susan. The man had no choice but to confess that they were connected by more than friendship. However, Teddy did have an alibi. His cell phone location showed he was at home during the call with Susan. The casings from his pistol also did not match the crime weapon, and another viable lead fell through. As soon as Melissa and Chris realized the perpetrator could be someone close or a client whose case had gone badly, they became afraid the killer would return to finish the job. Chris begged at the hospital to use a fake name for his father and not let anyone into his room. Investigators also exercised due caution and checked every family member's alibi. Melissa was at college about 5 hours away, and Chris had been at the movies with Juliet. He even had the ticket stub. Detectives went to the theater and reviewed surveillance footage that confirmed the young couple had indeed been at the movies at the time of the crime. By early September, John had recovered from several life-saving surgeries and dreamed of going home soon. That desire instantly vanished when he was finally told the devastating news about Susan. He simply couldn't believe it. He had lived all this time thinking he would soon see his wife again. John sat on the bed, helpless, completely blind, and having just lost the love of his life. His children's hearts broke just looking at him, and a little later he had to learn another bitter truth. Susan had been having an affair with Steady. Returning to the house where the tragedy occurred was beyond John's strength, so Chris and Juliet invited him to stay at their townhouse nearby. After all, it was a house that belonged to John. Chris had the chance to repay his father's kindness. During the day, a staff nurse cared for John, and Chris and Juliet helped with errands and drove him to doctor appointments. Months passed, Christmas came, and still no arrest had been made. John did the unthinkable. He returned to work. He conducted hearings, dove back into cases, and revived his law firm. The man used work to distract himself and recover emotionally. John refused to remain in a state of hopelessness and self-pity, but everything was far from rosy. Strange things began happening to John. While on vacation, Melissa got behind the wheel of her father's car to drive him to the doctor and nearly caused an accident. It turned out all the lug nuts on the left front wheel had been deliberately loosened. When the man returned to his own house and began slowly adjusting to living alone, the strange events continued. At any time of day or night, for no reason, the alarm system would go off. Imagine the panic of a blind, lonely man when fear for his life completely consumes him. And this could happen several times a day. John called repairmen, but it turned out all the wires had been cut. They fixed the wiring, and the next day it happened again. It was perfectly clear that someone intended to drive Sutton to his grave or scare him half to death. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detectives questioned every client at John's firm who had lost a case. Everyone had an alibi. Of course, in 20 years of practice, an attorney had been threatened with violence more than once, but there was no evidence anyone had followed through. Police had nothing but stacks of documents, crime scene photos, potential suspects, and polygraph results. They reviewed the case files over and over, trying to find something they might have missed. Finally, another breakthrough occurred. An arrest was made in a case completely unrelated to the Coral Gables attack. A man named Garrett Kopp had threatened two guys with a firearm. This happened 50 kilometers from the Sutton residence. During the investigation, it turned out that the attacker's pistol was also the murder weapon in the John and Susan case. But who was Garrett? Why would he want to harm a lawyer's family? The arrested man said he had bought the gun on the street from a stranger. That could well have been true, if not for one strange coincidence. Garrett had previously been to the Sutton home doing various odd jobs, and he had been hired by none other than Chris, John, and Susan's son. It turned out the two were very close. The guys met when Chris and his fiancée moved into the same complex where Garrett's family lived. Cop had been to Chris's parents' house many times and helped around the house. The young man had no steady job and desperately needed money, so Chris hired him whenever possible. A friendship developed between them. However, detectives found this friendship suspiciously close. Not every pair of friends calls each other 300 times a month, especially since Garrett had a reason to want the Suttons dead. He might have envied what they had, envied their perfect family relationships or something else. Surely the guy wouldn't have pulled off this crime alone. And then investigators turned their attention to Chris Sutton. On the day of the attack, Chris and Garrett had called each other 13 times. The last call came right after the movie ended, at the exact moment when Susan was already dead and John was in critical condition. Another red flag was how Chris reacted to the news of the tragedy at the family home. He was visibly upset, but at the same time pulled the movie ticket stub from his pocket and handed it to the officer, though no one had asked for it. You have to admit, it's strange to immediately proclaim your alibi when you've just been told your mother is dead and your father is gravely injured. At first, detectives didn't pay attention to it, but in light of new events, everything looked completely different. Now it was time to hear about Chris from people who knew him best, people who knew his family and friends. After hearing these accounts, investigators realized they were on the right track. It's impossible to imagine what went on behind the closed doors of the Sutton home. All that is known is how desperately the couple wanted a child, how overjoyed they were to adopt Chris, how they loved that little boy. But as it turned out, Chris was no angel. By age 13, his behavior began to change. He started doing poorly in school and stopped doing homework. Susan and John thought they just needed to get through this teenage phase and everything would work itself out. But it didn't. Over time, things only got worse, and more behavioral problems appeared. The teenager was expelled from schools his parents transferred him to. At home, his anger and aggression came out even more. He damaged walls and broke things. Chris even attacked Susan several times, trying to choke her. The Suttons sought help, wanting expert opinions from psychologists, psychiatrists, and pediatricians. Doctors diagnosed him with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One specialist said the boy had oppositional defiant disorder, when a child refuses to cooperate and is hostile toward peers, parents, teachers, and authority figures. The disorder is characterized by frequent tantrums, arguments, and irritability. This type of behavior develops when a child throws tantrums and instead of punishment receives sympathy, so he keeps trying to get attention that way. The Suttons worried about their son and tried different treatments, from cognitive behavioral therapy to medication. Nothing helped. Once Christopher and two friends caused $50,000 worth of damage to a teacher's house, spray painting walls and destroying all the furniture. The last straw was when the teenager took John's .22 caliber rifle, walked into the living room, and pointed it straight at Susan and Melissa. It wasn't loaded, but mother and sister didn't know that and were terrified. Instead of punishing his son, John sent him to his room. At 16, everything got even worse. Susan found a letter from Chris detailing how he wanted to kill his parents for the inheritance. Naturally, the boy claimed it was a joke, but it was another alarming sign. The parents truly didn't believe their son was capable of taking their lives or harming them. But when he got involved with drugs, they realized drastic measures were needed. One doctor confirmed that Chris was developing psychopathic tendencies, and this could lead to tragedy if action wasn't taken immediately. Susan and John researched places for troubled teens, Boarding schools, shelters, treatment centers. They settled on a place called Paradise Cove. It had a program designed to help teenagers overcome behavioral problems, a kind of reform school. Paradise Cove was located in remote American Samoa in the South Pacific. It was a facility for boys that opened in the early 90s, but the methods used there were highly questionable. They first used intimidation tactics to instill fear in every student, gain control, and achieve obedience. Chris was 16 when huge guys burst into his room in the middle of the night, restrained him, and put him on a plane to that distant island. In effect, the parents had arranged a kidnapping. John, being a lawyer, obtained a restraining order against 16-year-old Christopher, followed by a court order to remove him for re-education. The Suttons were promised their son would follow an academic program and they would receive weekly progress reports. The parents thought they were sending their rebellious teenager to a beautiful paradise island with no temptations, where Chris could enjoy natural beauty and simplicity and learn not to take everything for granted. After completing the program, they would see a changed person who appreciated their care. Susan and John even visited the island before sending Chris there. They paid a huge sum for professionals to turn him into a normal person. But how wrong they were. Paradise existed only in the name and the natural beauty of the place. The people running the program were far from educators. They abused their power and physically harmed the boys. It was a real prison for troubled teens. The camp was unsanitary, scabies, lice, ringworm. Residents were humiliated physically and psychologically. For any infraction, they were put in solitary confinement, restrained hand and foot, and deprived of food. The owner himself denied the abuses at Paradise Cove. But subsequent lawsuits and investigations eventually led the Samoan government to shut the place down. When the Suttons were finally allowed to visit their son a year later, he looked stronger, fitter, and seemed happy to see his parents. Chris tried to tell them about the harsh conditions, but his parents thought he was manipulating them. The agreement was that he had to complete the program first before coming home. The Suttons saw their son having a great time playing volleyball, swimming in the ocean, and happy to see them, so they left Chris there for another year in that hell. They didn't believe his stories about the terrible living conditions. In the end, that was their mistake. In the Paradise Cove situation, one can understand Susan and John, who saw the reform school as the last chance to turn their wayward teenager into a normal person. They were driven only by love for their son, but they truly didn't know what Chris had gone through. The idea was to make the boys value normal life through strict, sometimes brutal conditions. The teens followed a rigid schedule, exercised, and were kept constantly busy. However, they couldn't take a single step without permission, even to shower or use the toilet. They had to pass 6 levels to complete the program. As they progressed, they earned more privileges. For example, at higher levels they could call home and talk to their parents. All education was left to the students themselves. They studied the material on their own because there were no certified teachers on the island. Chris Sutton spent 2.5 years at Paradise Cove. He was allowed to return home only the day after his 19th birthday. His lawyer father managed to arrange it. It seemed the young man had returned to a normal rhythm. He finished high school, matured, and became more restrained. As a gift, the whole family went on a cruise to the British Virgin Islands together. That's where the young man met Juliet. His mother and father hoped the girl would keep Chris in line. A year later, they bought the couple a place in Miami while Chris attended college. Juliet started working at John's law firm. Susan became a second mother to her son's fiancé. She taught her how to dress stylishly, do makeup, and choose jewelry. John also treated Chris's girlfriend very warmly and accepted her as family. Christopher had been a difficult teenager when he was sent to that awful island school. But many years had passed, and now accusing him of attacking his parents didn't seem entirely fair. Chris began returning to normal family life. For a while, everything really was fine, although, as it later turned out, he hadn't changed at all. Some people don't change, they only learn to adapt and deep down, never forgive. It seemed Chris had harbored a grudge against both adoptive parents and was waiting for the right moment to take revenge. When investigators asked John if his son could have been involved in the attack, the man immediately rejected the idea. Chris had been by his side the whole time, helping his blind father with chores and caring for him. Juliet, Chris's fiancée, also said her fiancé was completely dependent on his parents. Even though he was 25, his mother and father paid for his car and apartment and financed his studies, and Chris was very close to his parents. To sort this out, police arrested Garrett Kopp for the attempted murder of Susan and John and subjected him to intense interrogation. The guy denied everything. Then officers decided to talk to his ex-girlfriend, and she revealed that on the night of the attack, Garrett came home and burned his clothes. When she asked why, Kopp admitted he had been involved in the crime. Faced with the evidence, Garrett broke and confessed to shooting the Suttons. According to him, he and Chris had been using and selling drugs together and were involved in many illegal schemes to make money. Garrett blamed his friend for everything because now his fate depended on a deal with police. Christopher had never forgiven Susan and John for Paradise Cove. He wanted revenge on his parents and also to collect life insurance payouts on both of them. The young man promised his friend Garrett $100,000 if everything went smoothly. On March 26, 2005, a warrant was issued for Christopher Sutton's arrest, though there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime other than the word of Garrett Kopp, the man who pulled the trigger. Chris attempted to flee, but was stopped by police and jailed. The only person who could testify against Chris was his fiancée, Juliet Driscoll. Detectives convinced the girl to tell them whether her fiancé had ever talked about planning to kill his parents. Susan had been like a second mother to Juliet, so she had no right to cover for a criminal. Juliet Driscoll faced the hardest choice of her life: help bring justice for the woman who had done so much for her, or stay silent and help Christopher avoid prison. Juliet burst into tears and told detectives that Chris had been planning this for years. The guy could not forgive his father and mother for the 2.5 years of hell on the island. At that last dinner, Susan and her son had argued over car insurance. The mother said she was no longer going to finance Christopher and that it was time he earned money for his own whims. That completely enraged the young man. It's possible that was the moment he made the fateful decision. He called his friend Garrett and then left the sliding patio door unlocked. The trial began in July 2010. Chris had a very good lawyer, but he couldn't convince the jury of his client's innocence. Another witness was found whom Chris had asked to find a hitman for his parents. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The family had to relive all the painful moments from 5 years earlier. On July 22, 2010, the jury found Christopher Patrick Sutton guilty of the murder of his adoptive mother and the attempted murder of his adoptive father. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. John Sutton addressed the court, saying there were no winners in this case. He had lost Susan, had lost Christopher long before, had lost his eyesight. Everyone lost. His words became the finale of this story. At the moment, John's life has stabilized. Despite his blindness, he is back practicing law. His firm is thriving. He swims, skis, and jokes that he met his new girlfriend on a blind date. The man still hopes for a miracle and invests heavily in vision restoration research. Who knows, maybe one day he really will see his new life again. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.